Hello, I'm Bob the Book Rat and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the Barbellion prize, and look, it's me talking about a book prize. Whoever would have guessed this? But this is a book prize that I started following last year and really greatly enjoyed. It's a prize to celebrate books written by and about disabled people, and particularly that breadth of a kind of an area for writing really means that we get some fantastic books in this every year. I have really enjoyed the 2 years I've been reading this, and I've read books from the first ever shortlist as well, which I've also really enjoyed. I think partly because it's such a broad area, and you'll see with this long list as we go through them that disability here takes many forms and is explored in many ways. So for example, we go from a fiction book, a novel around sort of someone's descent into paranoia and this sort of self-preservation of a child. We have discussions of activism around physical disability, particularly to do with the pandemic. We have a book looking at the life of Dorothy Wordsworth and her potential sort of health issues and various other things, and we have a book in the name of the winner that is all about self-care and about finding soothing, comforting words in the darkest times. So let's begin with the winner. It was just announced very recently that it was won by Letty McHugh with this book here. Sorry, I have to look at a screen for this because it's not something you can actually necessarily see on the front cover here. With the Book of Hours. And this comes from the idea of the Book of Days, this sort of old book of sort of prayers and thoughts that would be there not only as a source of wisdom, but also as a sort of soothing thing for people who are going through tough times. And so Letty McHugh writes this book of a sort of this Book of Hours, this idea of what kind of comforts can she find in trying to look after herself and her health whilst facing chronic illness. It's a self-published book, and it's the physical copy. I think you can read it on her website as well, but it's kind of interesting because of just how physically big this is. It's sort of pretty much A4, but you've got some pages that are sort of little diagrams and pictures and photos and all sorts of things. But I found this just an utterly charming and beautiful book. I think I mentioned in a weekly wrap-up, I read this just when I was ill in bed for a week and found this incredibly soothing. And that was, a temporary illness. That was just, a little bit of COVID and something else and what have you. That's something that fortunately happened, and then I was able to get well from, and without experiencing something like long COVID or what have you. And she, in this book, I think, does a really extraordinary thing of finding ways for herself and for others to make peace with chronic illnesses. So not only in terms of the day-to-day and how you get through the day, but also reformulating your life to understand that you can't do things that you perhaps could have done before. And I think she does this with such honesty and rawness, but also such tenderness and humanity in this book that was just absolutely beautiful. It's an incredibly charming and gorgeous book that really, I think, surprises you because it kind of at times comes out of nowhere. There'll be some rather quaint, nice things of, a picture she's taken or a reflection she's had, and it seems sort of quite, just nice. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, just the sort of, it feels like a nice, comfortable book, and then bam, something happens where she talks about a breakthrough she's had in thinking about her own life, or something that she has to reevaluate within her own life. And it's just a gorgeous book that I just was completely touched by and just found really utterly beautiful. And so I do really strongly urge you to check this out. It's a very worthy winner in my mind. It's just a beautiful book. And with that, let's go and talk about some of the other books that were shortlisted and longlisted for this prize. I've covered most of these in weekly wrap-ups, so I'll try and be brief, partly also because there are 7 other books to go through, and I'm going to go through from the alphabetical order of the surnames of the authors. So first up, after from the long list, we have Recovering Dorothy by Polly Atkin, and this is a non-fiction book looking at the life of Dorothy Wordsworth, and particularly her difficulties around her health and her well-being throughout her life. So she's already a figure who, by being the sister of William Wordsworth, often gets somewhat sidelined. You know, William Wordsworth is big, famous poet and, you know, beloved in the UK and elsewhere. And, you know, there's a lot that, even in the sort of a basic history, not looking at Dorothy's illness or disability, there's a lot still to say about the fact that Dorothy was the kind of the example almost of that adage of, you know, behind every successful man there's a powerful woman, and Dorothy was that woman who was just constantly a source of support when he was at his lowest, but also often came up with new ideas or helped him format things, or you know, was a sort of sometimes, you know, an extra brain behind the operation. And this book, I think, is just so beautiful in the way it looks at Dorothy Wordsworth's life. And the writer herself, Polly Atkin, feels this sort of kinship with Dorothy throughout the book, of sort of saying, well, actually, it sounds like from the diaries that Dorothy left that we share a disability, or there are some things around our health concerns that were quite similar, and also a sort of additional kinship about being women who are maybe sidelined in various ways in various industries. And it's just so beautiful the way that this book approaches Dorothy Wordsworth's life with real compassion and joy and celebration, whilst also saying, look, I can't diagnose her. It's not up to me to diagnose her. And there are things that she may have seen herself as being at the time that we now have different words for now. But it sounds like she had these sort of health concerns or these disabilities or what have you. And actually how that also shapes Dorothy as this sidelined figure in the background, because she maybe didn't have the ability to go and join William Wordsworth in doing some of these things, but she was still this incredibly important figure, not only supporting William, but in her own right as this interesting diarist and writer of poems and whatever else. So I just think this book is a really interesting one that I was so glad this prize introduced me to. Next up, we have Head Above Water by Shahd Alshammari. And I spoke about this again in a weekly wrap-up, but I think it's just such an interesting book that does quite a few things. So we largely get the experience of the author herself. This is a sort of non-fiction book with her talking about slowly coming to terms with understanding her disability and what that means for her and her career, and particularly for her as somebody teaching English and trying to help foster empathy in her students, that she is teaching in a country that is gender segregated for education. And so she talks about how teaching the women around her means that there's this sort of, an understanding when she's teaching Shakespeare around various parts, and they have a really interesting discussion around the gender relations in those books. But then when she teaches the same play to her male students, there's a very different conversation going on, and she tries in both ways to help them understand themselves and some of these wider conversations. But also within it, she's very aware that she is she's the older person in the room as the teacher, you know, but she is also her mobility is slightly impaired, so she often will be sat down in various parts of the class, and she sometimes worries that maybe takes away some of her authority, that she's not sort of standing tall and being at the heart of the class. She has to sit down or move very, very slowly to tell the next student to come and speak, or to move to a group to check out what they're doing. And so all the way through, she explores so many things around literature and stories and self-understanding in just such an interesting and beautiful way. And I, again, was just sort of really, this is a book I didn't really know what to expect from, because I think it moves in and shifts in so many different ways. It has so many different conversations. It's not a sort of a straight up memoir of her talking about her life. It's not a direct discussion about disability. It's not kind of one thing. It's this sort of blurring and merging in a really interesting way. Going on to something very different, we then have Lauren Foley with Polluted Sex. And this book is a set of essentially short stories, although I think that sort of sells it short because it's sort of pieces at times. So, for example, at one point we've got a song written out. At other times we've got little diagrams. Let me find one. Can't find the diagram, but there's a little part of a song here as well. And then, and then we've got like some diagrams alongside some bits and these other short stories. And it's just this sort of wild kind of scrapbook of things, but in a really fascinating way that deals a lot with particularly women and sexuality and the kind of relationships that they have to not only their bodies but to talking about sex and what have you, but also sort of a strong sense of place. This is almost everything is sort of set in and around Ireland and engages with Irishness in a really fascinating way, and also brings in disability in terms of how we sort of see our relationship with our bodies. The disability aspect is maybe lighter in this book than in some of the other ones on the long list, but I don't think that's not to take anything away from it. This book sort of approaches so many different things in such an interesting way, of the little intersections in life between various parts of our bodies and our identities and various other things. And some of these stories are incredibly funny, if tragic, talking about some really difficult matters, but also very, very sensitively and very funnily at times. It also just is full of just very different ways of approaching things. This is sort of it feels at times very experimental and at times very, sort of standard short story. And I kind of love that for this. This is just a really fascinating collection of things, which I just really greatly enjoyed. Next up, we have 163 Days by Hannah Hodgson. And I remember speaking about this on a weekly roundup, but essentially this is a collection of poems. The first half of this book is sort of about this sort of initial 163 days where she is in hospital, not particularly sure about what is going on with her, but her health is failing on several fronts. Some of her organs aren't working particularly well, or she's feeling incredibly rough in another way. Her tests are showing wildly variating results, and it's interspersed between her thoughts on what's going on around her and these little bits from what the doctor's notes are around her. So, for example, let's find a good example. Little improvement in bloods and blood pressure continues to be low. And then at the same time, she's got something alongside about how she's doing at the time. And sometimes those two things work side by side and make a lot of sense together. As in, she's feeling what they are saying is happening. Sometimes she's feeling something entirely different and has this very, very different relationship with what's going on in her body. And the doctors can't work it out or think something different or what have you. And it's fascinating watching her sort of mini battle with the medical world within that. And then the second half of this book is just sort of other poems, written just a little bit more about the relationship that she has with her body, with death, with illness, with so many other things. And I think she's really quite young as this book goes on. I think she's in her, because when she's talking about this 163-day period, she's talking about getting ready for some of her school exams. So she's incredibly young and going through a lot of difficult things without really any sense of how you're meant to approach some of these things. And I just found it really beautiful and so clever all the way through. Next up, we have Chouette by Claire Oshetsky. And I read this a bit over a year ago now, and absolutely loved this book. I thought it was just really phenomenal with how it approaches topics around motherhood and disability and identity and so many other things. But the key heart of this is we have this woman who's only really known in the book as Tiny. She becomes pregnant and she starts having these really intense thoughts about how this baby is going to be an owl baby, as in the bird, as in Chouette. And so she is convinced after this baby is born, she talks about this bird continuously as if it is an owl. And so she wants to raise this baby to be its real bird self. And she gets this sort of real protective sort of mother hen thing kind of coming over her, where if anybody tries to say that this baby is not a bird or what have you, she is very quick to jump in. But actually, as this book goes on, we get this really fascinating thing, I think, with the husband seemingly is at the end of his tether and is just thinking, my wife has gone mad. She doesn't know what she's doing anymore. We need to take the baby away from her before she accidentally harms it. But meanwhile, we're hearing the inside of Tiny's head, and she is talking about saying, well, no, you don't understand my baby. You don't understand this bird. It's got a broken wing. It needs to be looked after. And it's a really gripping and terrifying book, I found. This really affected me on a really visceral level, this book, because there's this dawning realization as the book goes on that either side kind of could be right. I think early on we're meant to think that we're meant to almost side a little bit with her husband and think maybe she's not, maybe she's having sort of real issues around postpartum depression or what have you. And as the husband seems to be trying to take the baby away, we also then start to get an insight into how this is a really deeply toxic and unhealthy situation, because he seems to be trying to take control and take all this power away from her, and Tiny is really resisting. And so there are times then we think maybe she is right to some extent, but it seems so outside of our understanding to think of this baby as having been born as a bird. And so we kind of go round in these circles, and it's really terrifying at times in this book, because our sense of reality is so shifted and so out of it that is just this. I mean, I love this book. It very nearly made one of my, it was a very nearly one of my top books of 2021. The only reason it wasn't is because I basically read it on like the last day of 2021. And otherwise I would have ended up wrapping up in one of my videos and making it one of my favorites of the year. But it's a gorgeous, brilliant book, if very hard to read at times, but I think in the best possible way. Next up, on a very different level, we have Hybrid Humans by Harry Parker. And this book is an attempt to understand how increasingly people who are disabled and or have lost limbs or various parts of their bodies are not working as they should, what that looks like when those start being replaced by various sort of technological interventions or innovations. So it starts with this idea of, if somebody has a robotic arm, or they have a sort of a constructed leg to replace, somebody's leg after an amputation or what have you, that those are ones that we, on the surface of things, kind of understand as being sort of necessary or as things that we can kind of get our heads around, that actually arms and legs are very useful to people in their lives, and so replacing them feels like a given if you've got the opportunity to do so. But this book then starts examining this idea of what does that look like if more of this starts happening, if more of people's bodies start getting replaced by various things, and actually what are some of the considerations that we have as humans about what that feels like for us. What does that also look like in terms of the sort of responsibility to do this for people? There'll be some people who might not necessarily want to do that, but do we have a responsibility to always make sure that that thing is offered? Do we prioritize some things over others? And do we start reaching this sort of age where even various parts of bodies are replaced, even when they've not been amputated, just to help people work and live lives more independently or in a happier way? And so it really engages with so much of this, and Harry Parker sort of is rotating around, visiting various trade fairs and people talking about things and these experts, and kind of getting a sense of what the national conversation is and international conversation is around this. And I found it really fascinating. It was a very quick and easy read, but so interesting just in terms of how we approach some of those discussions. And I was really glad that, again, this is a book that I probably wouldn't have necessarily directly picked up myself had it not been for the prize, and I'm very glad that the prize made me read it in the nicest possible way. And last but not least, Year of the Tiger, An Activist's Life by Alice Wong. And I spoke about this in a weekly wrap-up and really greatly enjoyed this. It's for a large part, it sort of serves as a bit of a memoir and explanation of Alice Wong's sort of various disabilities and health complications. But then it's also interspersed with these other things that make this a real kind of scrapbook again of a book. And so we have, for example, posters and activist things that were created by artist friends of hers, or we get extracts from interviews that she had. The transcripts are in the book with her speaking to other activists or friends of hers, or even at one point her parents, talking about her disability. And so it's this really complete picture of Alice Wong's life in a really interesting way, because we get a sense that she's an incredibly funny and warm-hearted woman who talks really candidly about a lot that's going on with her, but she's also incredibly powerful and feisty, and she is tackling issues in her local area. She talks about how a lack of access, particularly during things like the pandemic, really impact people whose disabilities and health complications are similar to hers. And the impact that has on someone, not only physically in terms of being able to get food, but also what it says about our place and our understanding within society, right? So that she finds that if the example being plastic straws, that she says paper straws and metal straws don't actually allow her to drink and kind of consume the nutrients she needs in a way that is particularly easy or accessible for her. So actually she needs plastic straws. But when plastic straws were banned in lots of cafes, that has a negative effect on her. But then she is made to ask for a plastic straw in a way that then almost makes her the problem. And it's fascinating to get these insights into what that looks like for her. And I think particularly given the whole breadth of disability on show in these 8 books, I think what's so fascinating is, Alice Wong is talking here about what's largely a physical disability in terms of being able to move, one in terms of how she's able to breathe and swallow and consume food and various other things. But this is sort of alongside various other forms of disability. And so she's this sort of community organizer, also bringing together lots of people who have very, very different experiences of disability, and how often, the approach for some places will be, we put down a ramp, everything's fine now. Or there's a lift, great, everything's fine now. And that's obviously really useful and really important, but it doesn't hit every box and doesn't always help people as much as we think it might do. And so I think with both this book and just the 8 books in total, I think it really speaks to how varied this experience is, or these experiences are, in such an interesting way. And so as a general point, talking about the entire long list, I just think this prize is vital for so many reasons, especially because of the way that it's able to expose writers to bigger audiences. Again, these are, I think, apart from Polluted Sex and Chouette, I hadn't heard of any of these books prior to the prize, and I'm really glad that I've read them now. They have enriched my life. They've given me a better understanding of so many of the various complications and arguments and ethical considerations within disability and within disabled people's lives. And I think that's incredibly important and vital. And I think with all of that said as well, Book of Hours, I think is just such a fantastic winner. Also really important, I think, that we have a self-published book being a winner of a literary prize. I think is a really big thing as well. But I think, read ones from this list that sound really interesting to you and that you think you'd enjoy. But really, I encourage you to just to check out some of these other really gorgeous books, and just especially the Book of Hours, I think personally, which was my favorite. But I think these are all gorgeous. Please do check them out, and please also any other suggestions you have for books in and around around disability. I think there's so much for us all to learn, and these writers are really leading the charge, I think. I've been Bod the Booker, talking about this wonderful prize. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.